In the aftermath of the Civil War, Willow Creek stood as a forgotten settlement in rural Georgia. Its buildings weathered by time and conflict, its people worn by loss. The small town's orphanage, a 3-story Victorian structure with peeling paint and creaking floorboards, sat isolated at the edge of a dense forest, surrounded by a rusted iron fence that seemed less designed to keep dangers out than to keep secrets in. It was here in the summer of 1866 that 14 children entered the care of the newly established Mercy Science Institute for Orphaned Youth. By winter, 7 had vanished without explanation. Of the remaining 7, only 3 would ever speak again. The most disturbing aspect isn't what happened to them, wrote Dr. Eleanor Blackwell in her sealed testimony, discovered in a courthouse basement in 1923 and promptly restricted from public access for another century. It's that no scientific protocol of the time could explain the physiological changes observed in those children. Nothing in our medical understanding accounted for what we witnessed. The incident might have remained buried in obscurity, if not for the discovery of a leather-bound journal in 2022, hidden behind a false wall during renovations of the old county records building. The journal contained detailed observations, medical sketches, and correspondence between the orphanage director and several prominent European physicians, documents that had been deliberately concealed from government inspectors when they finally arrived in February 1867. You might believe you know about the darkest chapters of post-war medical experimentation. You've perhaps read about the ethical compromises made in the name of advancing science during times of social upheaval. But are you prepared to confront a truth that challenges not just our historical understanding, but our fundamental belief in the protective boundaries of rational science? This wasn't about superstition or supernatural phenomena, as local rumors suggested. It was something far more terrifying. Scientific ambition divorced from moral constraint, operating in a community too broken to protect its most vulnerable. The town of Willow Creek no longer appears on modern maps of Georgia. The remaining structures were demolished in 1905 after a suspicious fire consumed the main street. Today, only an overgrown cemetery and the partially collapsed foundation of the orphanage remain, hidden among thick pines and kudzu vines that seem determined to erase all evidence of what transpired there. Visitors report an unnatural silence, no birdsong, no insect chirping, just the occasional whisper of wind through leaves that sounds unsettlingly like children counting in unison. Dr. James Holloway, the founder of the Mercy Science Institute, arrived in Willow Creek with impeccable credentials and generous funding from an anonymous northern philanthropist interested in the advancement of understanding regarding developmental resilience in youth subjected to severe societal disruption. His staff consisted of 3 assistants: Dr. Margaret Pierce, a woman unusual for her medical training, Mr. Frederick Thompson, a chemist who had previously worked for the Union Army, and Sister Agnes, a nun who had left her order under circumstances never fully explained. The post-war South provided the perfect environment for their work, a landscape of institutional collapse where oversight was minimal and desperate communities welcomed any form of northern investment. Willow Creek, with its high number of war orphans and isolated location, offered ideal conditions. Local authorities, struggling with reconstruction and famine, were eager to reduce their burden of orphaned children, particularly those whose parents had fought for the Confederacy. Records show the town council unanimously approved the institute's establishment after a single meeting, with no questions regarding Dr. Holloway's unconventional theories on childhood development and neurological plasticity. The children will receive education, sustenance, and the finest medical care available, Holloway promised in his presentation to the council. In return, they will participate in carefully designed observational studies that may revolutionize our understanding of the developing mind. What he didn't explain was his belief that trauma could be scientifically harnessed to unlock untapped cognitive potential, a theory rejected by his former colleagues at Harvard Medical School as dangerously unethical and methodologically unsound. The first indication that something was amiss came from Samuel Tucker, a 12-year-old boy who trapped rabbits in the woods surrounding the institute. On a misty October morning, while checking his snares, he heard what he described as counting that wasn't counting. Children's voices reciting numbers in a pattern he couldn't follow, their voices sometimes overlapping, sometimes speaking in perfect unison. When he moved closer to investigate, he spotted a girl standing motionless at an upper window, her palm pressed against the glass, her lips moving rapidly though no sound carried to where he stood. Her eyes weren't right, he later told his grandmother, who worked as a laundress in town. They were open, but she wasn't seeing nothing outside, like she was counting something inside her own head. When his grandmother reported this to Sheriff Daniels, she was dismissed with warnings about spreading tales that might discourage Northern investment in their struggling community. But Samuel continued his morning ritual, watching from the concealment of oak trees and documenting what he observed in a small notebook his father had carried through the war. He recorded the times windows illuminated in the pre-dawn hours, the unusual deliveries that arrived only on moonless nights, and most disturbing, the gradual reduction in the number of children visible during their supervised outdoor exercise periods. "Today I counted only 10, he wrote on November 18th. The little red-haired boy is gone, and the tall girl who always walked alone. Nobody came for them, nobody left with them. They're just gone, and nobody's asking where." The final entry in Samuel's observation journal, dated December 3rd, reads simply, "I saw what they're counting. God help them, I saw. And now I can't stop counting either." The boy developed a high fever that evening and spoke no coherent words afterward. Though his grandmother reported he would sometimes sit upright in bed at precisely 3:17 each morning and recite strings of numbers until his voice gave out. The first child to return to town was Anna Sullivan, age 9, whose older brother Michael had reluctantly surrendered her to the Institute's care after their parents succumbed to typhoid. Michael, working as an apprentice at the blacksmith's, had visited weekly until mid-November, when Dr. Holloway informed him that Anna was undergoing a critical phase of educational assessment and couldn't be disturbed for her own well-being. On Christmas Eve, Anna appeared on the town's main street, walking with mechanical precision despite the freezing rain. Her once auburn hair had been shorn close to the scalp. She wore a clean white nightgown and no shoes, yet showed no reaction to the cold mud between her toes. Michael, recognizing her from the smithy window, rushed to embrace his sister, only to recoil at her vacant expression. "Anna," he whispered, kneeling before her. "Annabelle, it's me. It's Michael." The child's gaze drifted past him as she recited in a flat voice, "Subject demonstrates improved cognitive sequencing. Temporal processing enhancement successful. Await further instructions." When Michael touched her shoulder, she flinched violently, then resumed her unnaturally straight posture. Dr. Pierce arrived within the hour, explaining that Anna had wandered off during a minor confusion in routine, and that her unusual behavior was a temporary side effect of fever treatment. Despite Michael's protests, the town doctor, himself overwhelmed with influenza cases and dependent on the Institute for Medical Supplies, signed papers authorizing Anna's immediate return to Holloway's care. "She needs specialized monitoring during this delicate recovery phase," Pierce insisted, her voice professionally sympathetic but her grip on Anna's thin wrist visibly tight. "We've seen this pattern before. The concerning behaviors fade within weeks under proper supervision." 3 days later, 10-year-old William Farnsworth was discovered sitting on the steps of the church, methodically arranging and rearranging small pebbles in precise geometric patterns. Like Anna, he spoke only in fragmented phrases that seemed quoted from medical observations. The pastor's wife noticed unusual marks at his temples, small, perfectly circular scars surrounded by bruised tissue. When she tried to clean and bandage these wounds, William became severely agitated, screaming numbers in a frenzied sequence until Dr. Holloway himself arrived to collect him. By mid-January, 3 more children had appeared in town displaying similar behaviors: emotionless affect, obsessive counting or sequencing activities, and an inability to recognize even closest relatives. Each bore the same circular scars at the temples, and some had additional marks along the spine. All were promptly returned to the Institute despite growing community unease. Sheriff Daniels, finally responding to multiple reports, paid an official visit to the orphanage on January 28th. His written account describes a facility of exceptional cleanliness and order, where the remaining children demonstrated unusual quietude but apparent physical health. Dr. Holloway attributed the behavioral abnormalities to a necessary therapeutic regimen addressing the psychological damage inflicted by war trauma, and provided documentation signed by 3 Boston physicians endorsing his experimental methods. What the sheriff's report failed to mention, revealed only in his private correspondence with the state governor, was the disturbing symmetry of the children's movements as they sat at their lessons. The way their pencils moved in perfect unison across identical pages, and the room he wasn't permitted to enter on the building's 3rd floor, from behind whose door came the rhythmic clicking of what sounded like telegraph machines. "I cannot claim evidence of wrongdoing," the sheriff wrote, "yet I cannot dispel the conviction that something unnatural transpires in that place. The children's eyes follow Holloway with such perfect coordination it appears choreographed. When asked direct questions about their welfare, they respond with identical phrases after precisely the same pause. It suggests not coaching, but something more fundamental, as though their very thoughts have been synchronized by some method I dare not speculate upon." Among the remaining children at the Institute, 1 demonstrated remarkable resistance to whatever procedures were being implemented. 13-year-old Elizabeth Winters, daughter of a mathematics professor killed at Gettysburg, had been specifically requested by Holloway due to her exceptional intellectual promise. Unlike the others, Elizabeth maintained awareness of the changes occurring around her and within her peers. Recognizing the danger, she developed strategies to appear compliant while preserving her autonomy. During the daily cognitive enhancement sessions, she would mimic the vacant expressions and mechanical responses of the other children while secretly documenting everything she observed. Using tiny scraps of paper hidden in a hollowed-out doll, Elizabeth created a coded record of the Institute's activities. "They begin with isolation," she wrote in a cipher based on prime numbers her father had taught her. 3 days without human contact or light. Then the counting exercises with the clicking machines. Those who cannot maintain the patterns are taken to the 3rd floor. None have returned intact. Elizabeth noted the gradual transformation of her fellow orphans, how they first lost emotional expression, then recognition of familiar faces, then finally their sense of individual identity. She documented the procedures performed after dark. Children strapped to chairs with metal bands at their temples, forced to synchronize their counting with mechanical devices while receiving electrical pulses of increasing intensity. "Dr. H believes he can create a collective intelligence," she wrote. "The children are not treated as individual minds, but as components of a larger cognitive network. The counting is not random. It's a processing language. We are being taught to function as human calculating machines, linked through some method I don't fully understand." As January turned to February, Elizabeth realized her own resistance was being noticed. During meals, Dr. Pierce watched her with narrowed eyes. Sister Agnes began checking her bedding each morning, searching for contraband. Most alarmingly, Dr. Holloway himself began to take a special interest in her cognitive profile, subjecting her to additional tests and monitoring her responses with unusual intensity. "Tomorrow they will take me to the 3rd floor," Elizabeth wrote in her final hidden note. "I've seen the specialized equipment delivered last week, the metal table with restraints, the silver instruments arranged with terrible precision, the glass jars labeled with children's initials. I know what happens there now. I know why some children vanish while others return empty. They are perfecting their process through trial and error. Those who cannot be integrated into their system are dissected to understand why. That night, as a winter storm lashed the orphanage with wind and freezing rain, Elizabeth made her desperate move. She knew it would be her only chance. The storm's intensity provided Elizabeth with the cover she needed. As thunder rattled the windows and lightning illuminated the dormitory in harsh flashes, she slipped from her bed and retrieved her carefully hidden documentation from inside the doll. Using a sewing needle she'd concealed in the hem of her dress, she pricked her finger and used the blood to write a final message on the inside of her forearm. Count backwards from 317. Remember your name. The building's ancient pipes groaned under the strain of freezing temperatures, and somewhere below, a window shattered in the violent wind. Elizabeth heard hurried footsteps as the staff responded to the disturbance, the momentary chaos she had been waiting for. With the practiced stealth of someone who had mapped every creaking floorboard, she made her way to the rear staircase, avoiding the main corridors where lanterns still glowed. What Elizabeth couldn't have anticipated was encountering William in the narrow back hallway. The boy stood motionless, his eyes reflecting the lightning in vacant flashes. For a moment she feared discovery, but then realized he wasn't seeing her at all. He was locked in whatever internal counting process controlled him now. "William," she whispered, touching his cold hand. "It's Elizabeth." His lips moved silently, numbers forming without sound. Then, unexpectedly, his mechanical rhythm faltered. His eyes focused briefly, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. 317, he murmured, the first words he'd spoken that weren't dictated by the Institute's protocols. "Elizabeth. Run." It was all the confirmation she needed. Squeezing his hand once in silent gratitude, Elizabeth continued her descent, finally reaching the kitchen with its delivery entrance. The door was locked, but the adjacent window had been damaged by the storm, its frame warped enough to allow her slim body to squeeze through after removing the remaining glass shards. The freezing rain struck her like physical blows as she stumbled into the night, clutching her precious documentation wrapped in oilcloth against her chest. The darkness was nearly absolute, but Elizabeth had studied the grounds from her window for months, mentally plotting this exact path to freedom. She moved away from the road, knowing it would be the first place they'd search, instead cutting across the muddy fields toward town. By dawn, soaked and shivering, she reached the home of Judge Henry Moore, the only person in Willow Creek with both the authority and independence to act against the Institute. Moore had lost his only daughter to scarlet fever years before, and was known for his unwavering commitment to child welfare despite the community's limited resources. "You must be half frozen, child," the judge's housekeeper exclaimed, ushering Elizabeth inside. "The judge is still abed, but—" "Please," Elizabeth interrupted, her voice hoarse from cold and fear. "They'll come for me. I need to show him what they're doing to us, to the others." Within the hour, Elizabeth sat in the judge's study, her documented evidence spread across his desk. The coded notes, translated with her guidance, the sketches of the devices used on the children, the precise schedule of treatments and their observed effects. Most disturbing were her detailed anatomical drawings showing the progression of scars and medical alterations performed on her fellow orphans. "And you believe they're attempting to link these children's minds somehow? To create some sort of human calculation network?" Judge Moore asked, his voice betraying both skepticism and horror. "It's more than calculation," Elizabeth explained, struggling to articulate concepts beyond her vocabulary. "Dr. Holloway speaks of distributed cognition and neural synchronization. He believes properly conditioned minds can share processing tasks across multiple brains. The counting is how they establish the connection patterns." Before the judge could respond, urgent knocking interrupted them. Dr. Holloway stood at the door, flanked by Sheriff Daniels and Dr. Pierce, their expressions a practiced mask of professional concern. "Judge Moore," Holloway began smoothly, "we've been frantic with worry. Young Elizabeth suffers from acute delusional episodes, a tragic consequence of her war trauma. She requires immediate specialized care." What followed was a battle of authority and evidence. Elizabeth's coherent testimony and documented evidence against Holloway's professional credentials, and the sheriff's reluctance to challenge the institute without clear jurisdiction. For hours, the debate continued in the judge's study, while Elizabeth felt her opportunity for justice slipping away. The turning point came when Judge Moore demanded to see the orphanage records, specifically documentation of the 7 children who had vanished. Holloway claimed they had been transferred to a sister facility in Baltimore, but could produce no transfer authorizations or receiving institution's acknowledgement. "I'm impounding all institute records pending a full investigation," the judge finally declared, "and the remaining children will be temporarily removed to—" He never finished the sentence. The distant sound of bells interrupted him, the town's fire alarm ringing with desperate urgency. Through the window, they could see thick black smoke rising from the direction of the orphanage. By the time authorities reached the institute, the main building was engulfed in flames. Despite the continuing rain, the fire burned with unnatural intensity. No children were found inside, neither dead nor alive. The staff had vanished as completely as the orphans, leaving behind only ash and the charred remains of equipment that defied easy identification. The search of surrounding woods yielded a macabre discovery. A small cave containing 7 glass jars, each holding a preserved human brain, labeled with initials matching the missing children. Nearby, partially protected from the elements, investigators found a leather-bound journal detailing surgical procedures and cognitive extraction protocols that no reputable medical journal would have published. The final pages contained Holloway's exultant notes about successful neural network establishment and distributed consciousness maintenance independent of original biological constraints. His last entry, dated the very morning of Elizabeth's escape, read, "7 failures have yielded 7 successes. The network sustains itself. The children count together even when physically separated. Phase 2 requires additional subjects, but the prototype exceeds all expectations. Individual consciousness successfully subordinated to the collective process." Elizabeth remained under Judge Moore's protection until spring, when state authorities finally responded to his urgent communications. By then, her health had deteriorated dramatically. The counting episodes began 3 weeks after her escape, moments when her consciousness would seemingly fragment, her eyes rolling back as her lips moved in the same patterns she had documented in the other children. "They're still connected," she whispered during a rare moment of clarity. "And part of me is connected to them. I can feel them counting, always counting, processing something vast that I can't comprehend." When government investigators finally arrived in April, they found little evidence of what had occurred. The fire had destroyed most physical proof, and locals had become reluctant to speak of the institute or its practices. Elizabeth's documentation provided the only substantial evidence, but her increasingly erratic behavior undermined her credibility as a witness. The case was officially closed in June 1867. The investigation concluded that while unfortunate medical negligence had occurred, there was insufficient evidence of deliberate wrongdoing. No charges were filed, no wider inquiry was launched. The incident was buried in bureaucratic records, another footnote in the chaotic aftermath of war. Elizabeth Winters spent the remainder of her short life in a private sanitarium in Virginia, funded anonymously. Hospital records indicate she would experience periods of normal function, interrupted by episodes of what staff termed mathematical seizures. She died in 1872, having never fully escaped whatever connection had been established among the orphans. The true horror of Willow Creek lies not in supernatural elements, but in the clinical calculation with which vulnerable children were sacrificed in pursuit of scientific advancement. Perhaps most disturbing is how easily the incident was concealed, how readily society accepted the disappearance of children already deemed dispensable by circumstance of birth and history. When we speak of ethical boundaries in research, we often forget that such boundaries were written in the blood and suffering of those who had no voice to protest their violation. The 14 orphans of Willow Creek remind us that the most dangerous monsters are not those of legend, but those who believe progress justifies any means, and the societies willing to look away when the victims are those they've already forgotten.